consider something like history, right?
Mm.
Well, which aspects of history do you want to cover? People have been moving for centuries, right?
Yes.
They haven't always needed a test, right? So actually, it could be the case that learning this dialect or this minority language or this, local language,
So technically, it's
it,
eradication of a dialect. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillah, salatu wassalam. Mr. Kamran, thank you for joining us.
thank you for the invitation. Walaikum salam.
So, Kamran, you are a linguist and I saw your work with ISSRA, like you wanted to join and you want to publish your papers. So, you tackle in immigration and the academia side. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what your roles are, and what kind of paper were you about to propose?
Yeah, so I work a lot on the role of language and multilingualism,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly the ways in which language is used to other. And there can be a massive racial element to that, which is still an area that's people are still developing because there's always a bit of hostility towards talking about issues of race and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the ways in which so one of the kind of key terms, key phrases that I was returned to is that language is in the terrifying ambiguity of belonging and discrimination. So
Mm-hmm.
people are constantly managing this, and for some people that's very easy, and for some people it can quite easily be turned against itself. So I work on things like citizenship testing, because that's related. There is a connection between the intensification of language requirements to become a citizen and just general increases in forms of securitization, which inevitably kind of connects us to Muslims, basically.
Mm-hmm. So they are particularly targeting Muslims, or do you think all immigrants in the UK right now?
Well, it's never one thing, right? So if you look at it historically, in the UK, for example, the main kind of waves of immigration post-Commonwealth, World War II, had some knowledge of English. So, people from the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's really interesting is the kind of justification. So we haven't always had citizenship language testing as a test.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting that that kind of intensified at the same time as kind of post 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of used as kind of border work rather than just educational kind of things. So and then you can use that to kind of, generalize these kind of barriers for people in general. But it can be amenable to kind of ideas of integration, which
So,
immediately connects us
so,
to
if
Muslims.
people who are on the fence would ask you the question, like maybe there is higher unemployment rate and people need to prioritize the local population before opening your borders to a newer population. So how would you answer that?
Well, in terms of the language requirements, I mean, so I work on the language aspect of it, and
Mm-hmm.
the issue here is there's one thing which is supporting people with education and giving quality courses, et cetera, taking into like consideration the holistic kind of forms of learning.
Mm-hmm.
Where it becomes quite tricky is when it's used as a gatekeeping mechanism. So it's not only used for example, citizenship or permanent residency, but it's also used in some countries as a way of so in some countries you have to take a test before you arrive or for family reunification. So
Mm-hmm.
already targets just being able to build a family, for example. And that's where it becomes particularly tricky and problematic, let's say, because it's we're not just talking about support, we're talking about a very political usage of language requirements, etc., etc.
So for people who are still, I mean, I'm not talking from the right or from the left. I'm
Yeah.
talking about from the perspective of people who are in the fence. They would say like it helps in integration. If you learn a language to a higher level, you not only learn a language, but you also embed in the culture. So
Yeah.
what is your answer to those people?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things about that. One is that the process towards this doesn't just if you go from the perspective of a migrant right, in a new country,
Hmm.
everything for them, if they already speak one language before, is automatically multilingual.
Mm.
So the process, by definition, of incorporating yourself into this new community, country, etc., is multilingual anyway, because you're adding a language to something you already know, and you're meeting people at different levels, and so different people need different levels of support. So that's one thing. So it's a multilingual construct by definition.
Hmm.
The second part is migrants have always been moving, and the issue is about the role that the testing has, because effectively you're putting a quite big condition on them being able to participate. So it's entirely possible, for example, to be a participative citizen who may not just be good at taking tests, but they participate in, they can work, they can do other things. In our research, we've seen that.
Hmm.
You speak to people and they're great. It can go the other way where someone's passed the test, but they can't really survive. Maybe they're just good at doing ABC tests, right?
Hmm.
So I think it's the rationale of these things. And as with everything in terms of integration, it's always a kind of it's like a moving target, right? What's considered well integrated one day is not considered well integrated in another. It can be moved, the levels can be increased, etc. So those type of issues come into it. So those are some of the issues about integration.
Hmm. So, you know about the Western or in general European standards, like they have this process of codification. So, what alternative solutions would you rather propose?
Well, you can have people need support, right? And so it's
Hmm.
almost meeting people where they are, right? And that's historically what's been done in many countries. So my point is that migrants have been able to go into countries and find their way before testing ever existed. People have been moving for centuries, right?
Yes.
They haven't always needed a test, right? So it's the function of the tests within all of this. Why now, for example,
Hmm.
and also the intensification of these, because they're very amenable to political discourse. So, for example, this is one of the key kind of connections with security, for example, is that people who are not well integrated are more likely to become like radical extremists, etc. That's a very kind of pointed at Muslims kind of statement,
Hmm.
right? Um,
It's a stereotype, not a
yeah,
factual statement. It's a stereotype. Yes.
yeah, because there's many well integrated people who become radical, or if you, for example, if you use that radicalization kind of angle, there are many people who are fluent in English who still become radicalized towards the far right, for example.
Yes.
So that's where it kind of falls apart. But what it does have is it has a really strong kind of compelling argument that makes sense, common sense to people. That, of course, if you're isolated, but these things are more likely to happen. But there are many people who are very fluent, who are very proficient, who are very radical or very extreme too. So I think it's whether you're looking at language as something political or educational, and I think it's become more political than educational.
Hmm. So, I mean, at least UK is different. You have these different dialects, and most people are required to do RP. But in general, like most of the other parts of Europe, you have different languages, and most of them do kind of learn the national language,
Yeah.
standardized language, rather than the dialects, local dialects. And what effects does that have when you have a standardization of one language?
Well, that's an interesting
One
one.
dialects, rather. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting point because integration at a local level may mean being fluent in a minority language or a dialect. So I'll give you an example here. In Spain and Catalan, in Catalonia,
Mm-hmm.
now it could well be the case that for my everyday life to work with my boss, where if let's say I'm picking fruit in a field, yeah, which is quite common
Mm-hmm.
in some parts of Catalonia, right? It could be that I need Catalan a lot more because that's how I need to interact with this local guy
Local
who's in the
population, yes.
countryside. Yeah. Yeah, the test would be in Spanish only because ideologically they have their own idea. The government has its own idea of the value of the languages and the communities and the unification they want. So actually, it could be the case that learning this dialect or this minority language or this, local language,
So technically, it's
it,
eradication of a dialect, your own, what do you call dialect? And so this process doesn't really work in some places. I mean, even across Europe, because not just one
yeah,
country has one language, but different dialects.
Exactly right. So if, as I said, if you're thinking of it as a very kind of ideological thing, which is that in this country we speak one language, and the reality, even for locals, is very different. You may be actually very well integrated because you speak the local language or the dialect or whatever it is,
Hmm.
and yet the test would be in something else. So does that really reflect your everyday life, right? So those are some of the things that go into it. Again, always ask yourself with these tests, like, why now? Why didn't we have this 100 years, 50 years ago or something like that? So those are something complications that come into this. What do you actually need in your daily life? Because that's actually the real, let's say,
Hmm.
between, the real form of integration, let's say. And then there's this very kind of ideological kind of construct of what integration is.
And do you think it has only effects with the eradication of dialects, or do you think it has other implications when you force people to speak one particular dialect or?
Well, there's a really famous book called The Monolingualism of the Other by Jacques Derrida, and he uses the experiences of Jewish immigrants, like
Mm.
Jewish populations, right? And what he talks about in that, so he was born in Algeria, right? And he talks about how a lot of Jewish people at that time were learning French, yeah, and they
Hmm.
would kind of leave behind some of their customs because they were trying to assimilate to this kind of Frenchness. And I think, he even talks about like the role of language, right, of
Yes.
kind of, going towards French. And his point was that it kind of turned back on itself when they were hostile towards the Jewish population. That it didn't matter. Almost at that point, what was, look what they lost and what they embraced, and at the end, the way they were treated was they were still not accepted in that respect anyway. So it's making space for the kind of whole identity almost. I mean, are you having to give up something to do all of this, or is it
Yes.
all of these things can coexist, right? And so a multilingual approach is yeah, everyday life is multilingual, right? And we kind of manage these things somehow. So
And also, like when you have a one language system, I think you might have a hegemonic system because there's always how do I say control
yeah,
because
absolutely.
language shapes your thought. Language shapes your thought and your culture. So if you standardize one language, the way we speak, you kind of ostracize other
Yeah, absolutely.
communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a key part of nation building, one nation, one language, right? Uh,
Yes.
so if you fall out, by definition, if you fall outside of that, whichever group you are, you're immediately the other, or you're immediately within the hierarchy.
And this falls
Uh,
for every single country. We can't
exactly.
leave one country out. Yeah. Even a
No.
small country like the UK, you have like so many accents, Essex, Cockney,
Yeah.
what do you call it? Birmingham accent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so even within one language, you're going to get a hierarchy of like purity, right? And
Yes.
who's at the top? It tends to be related to class. It tends to be related to history,
Hmm.
et cetera, right? Or even a global level, the types of global Englishes that exist, right? And
Yes.
particularly the ways, how it racializes as well about who's considered a native speaker
Hmm.
and who isn't, even though they may speak the same language. And so
Especially
all
with
of
the
that.
with the income as well, right? Like you teach English, but then what do you call it? The UK or the US gets a higher va wage compared
Yeah.
to people from Ireland as well.
Yeah, yeah.
They
It's
get
very yeah.
discriminated. Yes.
Yeah, it's very possible. There may be a hierarchy in hiring practices. There may be particular hierarchies of purity, right?
Yes.
So, you see it less now, but you used to see a lot of kind of schools looking for native speakers, irrelevant whether they could teach or not, right?
Yes.
Because there's a kind of um,
A culture.
prestige.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a prestige, and it sells, and they try to sell it to students. And again, that's an ideological kind of
Stereotype.
idea. Yeah, it's an idea of what counts as being pure, what's higher in the hierarchy, right? So yeah, although it doesn't seem complicated, but there's a lot of history that goes into these things.
So tell us a little bit about your what do you call some of these examples from what do you call the immigration test, the language test, like what kind of examples you've seen and you say that this should be changed? Because Europe does have this codification process for almost everything. So what kind of solutions? Because I did ask you that question and you did give me an answer, but like we know about the European culture, it has this codification thing. So what possible solutions would you propose?
Well, so there's kind of two like philosophical ways of dealing with this.
Mm-hmm.
There's one which is how do we make a better test,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if we change this, if we change elements, if we make it multiple choice, if we make it with this and we make it with that, that's one argument. The kind of deeper argument is whether that kind of precondition should exist in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Not that you shouldn't learn or not that you it's not useful. I don't think anyone doubts that. It's about like, can your family be together based on your language proficiency? Should you choose a partner? Is it easier to choose a partner? Like, should that be like, those, that kind of family construction about language comes into it because, in some countries they do have it's a requirement to enter the country in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's probably the deeper argument about whether they should exist at all. Um, so the issue with just trying to change the test is that people's learning is so diverse and what they bring and their histories and what language they speak as their first language, what they start off with is so different that again, what you're saying about standardizing
Mm-hmm.
you just cannot manage everything in people's lives every day,
Mm-hmm.
for their needs. So again, like I said, if you just look at the foundations of these tests, they're really immigration control. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's been about being able to decide who's a legitimate citizen and who's not. Now, if I say to you, well, should we have this level or this level for the test? Most people probably don't even know the difference,
Mm-hmm.
to be honest. And they probably won't even notice in everyday life. That's the reality.
Do you think, like, if we with this current standard, do you think that the average UK person would pass these tests? The
Well,
local.
yeah, so I actually do this with some students sometimes, and
Mm-hmm.
or I've well, there's been other people who've done it. Um, off off the top of your head, probably won't pass. Be lucky to pass if you're just going off the top of your head.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when in our research, what people tend to compare it to is the driving theory test, where it's a very specific preparation for a performance of 45 minutes and you can get through it that way. So just experience and just from what I've read, people don't tend to pass it just off the
Mm-hmm.
top of their head. If they read the book and all of it, because it's preparation materials, yeah, that you can pass.
Mm-hmm.
But it's obviously assumed that most native British, let's say, know that stuff already. So all those things come into it.
Presumptions. You're
Yeah,
building on
but
presumptions here.
even if you consider something like history, right?
Mm.
Well, which aspects of history do you want to cover?
Yeah.
Right. And that goes
Yep.
for a lot of European countries, let's say,
Yes.
given some of the things, in the past, which parts do you want to cover? So again, not as simple as it seems. And as I said, it's very ideological because it's a very kind of narrow idea of what it means to be, from Belgium or Spain or whatever it is. So do you just miss out all the bad parts and the bits you're uncomfortable with and all those
You
things come
cherry
into
pick
it?
what you like about the history, right? Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So, or let's say if we talk about values, are they really specific to that country, or are they just kind of universal
Mm-hmm.
values that are just kind of framed that way, right? Because if you're saying that they're framed that way, you're kind of insinuating that other people don't have those. And
Mm-hmm.
again, something as simple as that is a lot more complicated than it looks. So one of the things that I'm quite interested in is the connection between security
Mm-hmm.
measures and language.
Mm-hmm.
So there's different areas I'm quite interested in. One is the ways in which the testing has become a part of the security apparatus. So this ranges from whether your score in the test allows you to be a legitimate citizen or if you have the capacity to integrate.
Yeah.
But it can also be within, and there's other research that's looked into this, is the actual performance of the exam of the security measures that are required. Because you get, we know from different types of research that, there's a kind of whole security procedure about identity and making sure you're not carrying anything and all of those things. And so there's that element of security. But and I'm also interested in the ways in which language in everyday life gets associated with Muslims and security. So the
Hmm.
common one is if you speak Arabic in the airport or in the airplane and, people get suspicious and all of those things. And, there's so many cases of people being kicked off airplanes. And all of that is, again, based on the kind of like perception. There's like a regime of perceptions, right?
Hmm.
Of people being almost preconditioned to have some sort of fear about this.
So with the language, I mean, what about what do you call nowadays? You saw the former president of the U.S. using the word "inshallah," just throwing. What are the consequences of just using words?
Yeah, I think always it's quite contextual.
Mhm.
On the one hand, I've seen wallahi a lot, even from non-Muslims. And so there's
Yes.
this kind of entry into like mainstream kind of language. I think a lot of sports stars have a lot to do with this, like could be footballers,
Hmm.
etc. I saw Thierry Henry, for example, the other day saying "Assalamu alaikum" to Hakimi from PSG, just at the beginning of the interview, which is not something you always used to see. So
Hmm.
and I think that kind of just reflects the everyday usage that's becoming more, people are more comfortable with it. It's more everyday on the one hand. So again, if you go back to just what I was saying earlier about like this kind of link, almost kind of flip side of belonging and discrimination, that's a really good example of that, where in one space it's actually kind of a form of, you can be discriminated against because it represents
Hmm.
something that's not right for that context of the people, the people that it represents. On the other, it can be indicative of everyday life, how that's changing and how, yeah, how kind of life is changing, right? And language is a really sensitive, um, language is a really like interesting and sensitive reaction to how everyday life changed because that's actually something we use every day, and the words we use
Yes.
kind of show that,
Yes.
right? How
Yeah.
comfortable we are.
With what do you call connotations, we can identify what is the word used positively or negatively as well.
Exactly.
So here's with connotations. Um, in academic works, how often are Muslims portrayed? What is the usual connotation with
Of
Islam or Muslims or anything related to Islamic? So
y-
do we always what do you call it? Is the academic work always shedding light on Islam in a negative light or with a more positive light?
yeah, I think it's obviously academia is quite broad and
Hmm.
there's so many different subjects. I think what's always quite interesting,
Let's start with Orientalism, maybe. Let's start with
yeah.
Orientalism, like pin the nail. Like, how does Orientalism paint Islam and Muslims, especially in the West, people who are living in the West?
Yeah, so I mean I work within the immigration with
Mm-hmm.
that kind of like kind of sphere.
Mm-hmm.
And one of it comes through various forms, right? It can be the good immigrant of someone who's kind of willing to kind of embrace certain things and give up others. There are kind of variations of, I mean, the problem with always having a good immigrant then is that you can have the opposite then as well of someone who doesn't do those things and is considered kind of bad. And neither of them are particularly considered to be a genuine part of like the kind
An
of fabric
identity
of,
of
yeah, of like
community.
the,
It's more like an
yeah.
individual thing, yeah.
That's on the one hand, and then I mean, there's so many different things. I mean, there's the kind of enemy within when there's an intensification of security discourses that people are looking for, kind of these markers of identity and things like that. And there's so many, right? There's kind of women that need to be rescued from Muslim men and that type of kind of
That's right.
yeah, yeah, and that comes up a lot just in terms of immigration sometimes, in terms of those things. So, I think whenever whenever we look at kind of figures of Muslims from researchers, they also need to have a really good understanding of what they're looking at and how they're attuned to these things because not all of Europe considers religion or even Muslims to be legitimately a part of like everyday society, right? Especially in academic circles. Maybe the UK's, we have a bit more presence here.
Hmm.
But even just, having space for religion, even in some European countries within academic circles, is a bit unusual. And the kind of biggest, kind of most visible figure of that is Muslims, right? So that's always quite interesting.
Sure. So, would you like to expand on the importance of Muslims entering into the academic sphere and changing the narrative, not for a favorable, but more for a just cause, for something that. Mhm.
Yeah, so I think it's, we're talking about like Europe in general, right? And I think, they're very exclusive spaces, they're kind of elite exclusive spaces that are not easy to enter for many people, and much especially for people who, let's say visibly or very much practicing
Mhm.
Muslims, let's say. And that's very difficult. So one of the kind of peculiarities about academia is that it's very insular. And in, many places, you kind of need to know someone to help you get inside the system and work the system and understand how it works and all of these things. It means being attached to projects that have financial backing, or knowing the right people, or where to publish. Even
Mhm.
something as simple as like where do you want to publish, right? All of those things. And I think what's so I talk about this a lot with my friends in terms of, are Muslims considered to be theorists, for example, in
Mhm.
the same way as their counterparts? Or one of the kind of like, it's not a nice thing, but one of the kind of continuing kind of things that I talk about with some of my friends is, quite often people like to be near Muslims to access communities because it's interesting. They can't access them otherwise, and they speak the language and they understand. But then what happens to them afterwards? Do they get the same benefits for their career as the kind of project leader and all of these things? And do they have the same space to kind of develop their careers?
Mhm.
Um, and well, I mean, just take a look at the universities. Just have a look at the kind of the leadership, etc. In a lot of research fields. So it's always an interesting thing because you get these kind of like high level academics who are able to kind of set an agenda for how a field can shift and what people should be looking at. Um, and 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 the reality is a lot of Muslims don't get to that level, right, in Europe because the conditions are so difficult. It's a precarious job anyway, even at the best of times, even for Muslims, non-Muslims. And then
Mhm.
within that, obviously, it's even more difficult for many. So navigating those systems is a real challenge. Um, and so it's definitely not easy. I think in a lot of places.
Which area do you think Muslims need to focus right now in the current environment? Like, I know it depends on the country, especially
Yeah,
the more densely populated Muslim country, not Muslim countries. Muslims in
yeah,
a country are have different challenges from countries like the Central or Southern Europe.
sure.
So, what kind of areas do you think we need to focus on as a community, perhaps?
Yeah, it's hard to know because I don't. There's a lot of fields I don't know about, but what I do know about is social sciences and humanities.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, like those are the areas just because I deal with them the most. We definitely need a lot more there because I think we're seeing with just how things are going in general that you didn't you can't just all be doctors and y- there's so
Doctors and
much.
engineers, yeah.
Yeah, doctors and and that's
And
fine.
they all end up in IT companies working for what do you call data analyst or
Yeah,
as
and that's great as well. I mean,
I mean you study something and then you end up in as a data
yeah.
analyst. So why don't you just study also arts because there's opportunities here as well, right? Like social sciences or arts.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. So in terms of just the ways in which knowledge can be kind of transmitted to other people,
Yes.
the insider knowledge that Muslims, in general may have about their own communities, there's a nuance, there's an authenticity
Mm-hmm.
that you just can't replicate. And it's the same as if we try to start researching communities that we don't really know about. Yeah, we can represent it. That's all we can really do, right? But
Mm-hmm.
we don't have that kind of sixth sense feel for what's happening and what's interesting. So I think the other challenge is that in the end, your predominant audience in academia will be like non-Muslims as well. So you're trying to kind of manage that as well. And that's not always easy as well in terms of, it's just a challenge, right, of educating and also trying to just move things forward at the same time. You have to assume some people just don't know anything other than what they've seen on TV, right? So I've been
Hmm.
in spaces where the main concern is about Muslim women wearing hijabs, right, in some academic circles, right? Now, Muslim women are very holistic, right? There's so many other issues going on as well that fixating on that one issue when there's other things happening, racism, labor market kind of opportunities, education,
Hmm.
all these things are also part of the picture as well, right? So yeah, it's really tough in general. Yeah, trying to just enter those spaces and then being able to set some sort of agenda because you're inevitably connecting to audiences and also in terms of just generating funding. You're trying to create projects and research that kind of manages all of this at the same time, and that's not
Hmm.
always easy.
Yes. Yes. So, my other question would be, I think related to, um, what do you call? Do you have anything else you want to add, actually?
Yeah, I think what's one of the things to consider as well is that you can't produce knowledge if you're not there.
Hmm.
And that affects people in different ways. One is that it's academic life is you tend to do a lot of part-time stuff, very insecure work for a long time, and then you may get your opportunity to have something more substantial. It's becoming more and more of an issue in general.
Hmm.
And then if you think within that, minority groups are going to suffer more, just because, you know,
Do you think it's also a challenge because the minority groups are already immigrants, so they have to learn the local language, but also at the same time earn, make a living, but at the same time because they have to pay tuition fee, which is not cheap as
mm,
well, and on top of that, challenging with studies. So you cannot get a visa, you cannot come here without a visa. I mean, I'm talking from
mm,
outsiders' perspective because we didn't
sure.
speak from that. Um, how would you like, what advice would you give for people who are coming to Europe from
It's
outside?
very tough. In terms of stable, I mean, you can maybe get work and that kind of keeps you going for one project to the next, but it's very hard for, I mean, most people coming of a particular age, I mean, unless you're 21 and single, everyone else outside of that is trying to build a life, they want to build a family, and that's not easy to deal with, having that kind of level of insecurity, trying to finance your visa, etc.
Yeah.
If you're from outside like that.
Hmm.
And so it's very precarious. It's definitely not easy. So I think it's always, having supportive networks of making sure you're going in with your eyes open about some of these things and some of it is luck or destiny as well. So definitely not easy. And higher education in general is becoming it's getting tougher. I mean, you see in the US, for example,
Hmm.
it's getting really tough to survive in that as well. And to be honest, you're only ever one government away from everything truly falling apart anyway, because you've seen it in the US,
Yes.
you've seen it in other countries Hungary, for example,
Yeah.
how that
I
can
think
go.
even the
So
Netherlands as well. Yeah.
yeah, so I wouldn't, so it's definitely not easy. But yeah, you definitely need some sort of support network, I think, and some kind of alternative way. Sometimes the kind of like orthodox way of getting there is maybe not our path as well. So I have to think a bit more laterally. But it's definitely not, it's a systemic thing. It's not an individual thing.
Hmm. So yeah. Do you have anything else to add or like
Yeah.
anything important particularly?
Yeah. So just in terms of that as well is there's so much work that never gets seen
Hmm.
by academics who couldn't survive because the precarity, the racism, even if they're pushed out for those reasons.
Hmm.
So there's so much great work that we just never get to see. So there's actually a term for that, which is called undone science.
Hmm.
So this is work that people want to do, but they were never able to kind of survive in academia long enough or to get that permanent kind of state where they could kind of sit back and really start getting that work out there.
So how can Muslims help out these academic works to reach out to other people and to collaborate? Do you think there should be some kind of a WACF system for education or scholarships where we can collaborate, or do you propose it's mostly local that we need to focus?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of both because you do need your immediate network to be able to support you
Mm-hmm.
and to understand how this particular system works and what you need to do and how that works. But I think it also helps when you're able to kind of connect with people in other contexts and kind of share what you do. I think that's starting to happen, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing kind of like these type of conferences and working groups, etc. Because you never even, you don't want to feel isolated and that you've got nowhere to go. And I think those kind of networks and groups are starting to be established to some extent. I'm not really sure how formal they are, but yeah, all that kind of sharing practices of, helping each other, guiding each other, because it's a complex kind of little world in itself, and knowing how it functions, how other people do it, or having the space to be able to like compare and work together and go for things together
Mm-hmm.
it is always really important. So I mean, it's helped me a lot. So but inshallah, things are starting to change. Let's see how it goes.
Inshallah, inshallah. So, would you, if anybody wants to connect with you, would you like to share your contact, your Instagram or your email? Where do
Yeah,
you think?
so
Yeah,
I have Instagram, which is I think Kamran
I'll put it
Khan
on the link.
Linguist.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
put it on the
the
link. Yeah.
Instagram and I think I'm on Blue Sky as well, which
Okay.
I don't use so much, but I should probably try to a bit more. So
Sure.
yeah, those are the two
So
main
you can
ones.
send me the link and I'll put them in the
Sure,
description. All
sure,
right.
inshallah.
Jazakallah khair for coming, and
So,
inshallah, hope to see you again then.
okay, Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.